I guess you listen to John tell you to lock your doors, come visit Great Island, look at the new schools. You listen to Steve talk about all the new developments in town, the new restaurants, the nail salons, and everything else great that's going on. You listen to Jill talk about sports championships, a new auditorium, how great our schools are. And I guess my job is to now talk to you about how do we actually pay for it all. So hopefully we still have a quorum here, and I'll try to not be too long. Okay, I'll just
change the slides here.
Yep, okay. Okay, thanks, Mike. Okay, I just wanted to start off by introducing members of my board here. You know, this is my, starting my 10th year on the Board of Finance, and before that I spent the better part of 8.5 years on the RTM in the seats that you all are sitting in today. My vice chair is Dan Baumgardner. Dan's coming on his 5th year as my vice chair and one of my strongest partners on the board. Taylor Carter and Rob Cardone, both of which have been on the board for 7 years now. Paul Hendrickson, who has 15 years tenure on a board. And then we have 2 new members of the Board of Finance that recently joined this year, Malin Gasserud and Jenny Schwartz, both of which came from this body. And so I'd like to welcome them both to this board. I'd also like to take a minute and just recognize, John Walcott, who served on the board for about 3.5 years and stepped down this year. And also David Martin, who passed away at the end of July this summer. David was a member of the board for over 4 years. He was extremely hardworking. He was extremely bright, served on a number of very important committees, considered him a friend, and I think we all counted on him a lot. So just want to say we all miss him. And last and not least, Jennifer Charneski, who is our finance director, and is currently, as John pointed out, acting as our co-town administrator. So she's got a full plate. So this is a slide I used a couple years ago, and I'd like to talk a little bit about at least how we view the town and our approach to financing the town and financing all the services that need to be delivered. As John pointed out, there's a lot of things that make Darien There's a lot of things that make Darien great, and I think there's a lot of things that draw our people to move here. One, as Jill touched on a lot during her presentation, which had lots of music and videos and so forth, so I'm not going to entertain you with any of that, but is our schools. Our schools, high school, middle school, and elementary schools are generally ranked at the top, if not among the top, of all the schools in Connecticut and certainly in the surrounding areas. Our teachers and our staff that we have there are among the best in the state, and I think one of the core reasons why people do move to Darien is for the kids to attend these schools. But they also, as John pointed out, move here because it's a very good investment. Home values in Darien have showed fairly consistent appreciation over the past 22 years that I've been in town here. And as John mentioned, currently there's a very low volume of real estate on the market, which has generally continued to propel and home values upward. During the recent reappraisal that took place last year ahead of our sending out our property tax bills, the average homes in Darien over the past 5 years went up by 25%, and that was fairly consistent throughout all 5 quintiles when we look at the grand list. Our parks and beaches, right? Another reason that people move here, and I think something that folks value significantly in our community. Particularly with post-COVID and additional work and the additional number of days that people work from home. I think the ability to access our parks and beaches and other outdoor spaces is becoming increasingly important and increasingly helps us to compete against and look attractive relative to our neighboring towns. Our public services, I touched on the education services, but if you look at our public works, our parks and rec program, if you look at our fire, police, EMS, and other emergency medical services, they're all ranked among the top in the state. When you look at our other social and health programs here, all of our services, our roads, our infrastructure, our sewer, absent the small mishap that we had last weekend, are all in great shape. So the town as a portfolio, I think, is very attractive. Geographically, we're close to New York City, which is one of the largest financial capitals in the world, access to great jobs in a sort of very vibrant market, and we're about a 55-minute train ride to Grand Central. Lastly, taxes, which we'll talk about. That's how we pay for all of this. Taxes, if you look at Lower Fairfield, we continue to remain one of the most attractively taxed towns in the state of Connecticut. Other than Greenwich, our mill rate, which incorporates the value of our homes, is among the lowest in the state. All of these together, we think, make Darien a very attractive place to live. Talking about mill rates, the very bottom line, I stacked up here, starting from the bottom to top. Greenwich has the lowest mill rate, followed by Darien, New Canaan, Westport, Rowayton, Fairfield, Ridgefield, and Wilton. And as you look across this graph, you'll see a couple blips on all of the different mill rate lines. Those generally demark a revaluation. So you can see on the far right of the graph, Darien dips down from fiscal year 2024 to the current fiscal year 2025 that we're in. That was a result of our grand list basically appreciating by 25%, and therefore we saw our mill rate come down materially, even though the dollar amount of taxes that you all pay went up by about 4.5%. So locally, I think we continue to remain very attractive. What did 2024 look like, the fiscal year that we just ended on June 30th? On the revenue side, property taxes again came in higher than expected for two reasons. One, we have small additions in the grand list throughout the year: kitchens, bathrooms, pools, the acquisition of new automobiles. And also we assume that we only collect around 99.5% of the taxes on each of January and July, so we bake in a little bit of a cushion. When in reality, our tax collector brings in close to 100% of our taxes. Secondly, if you look at other revenues, we were $4.2 million ahead of schedule. The majority of that, $3.2 million, was related to investment income that was $3.2 million higher than what we had projected. Interest rates remained high. Our treasurer took on a number of new investments, including treasuries. The Fed cut rates much slower than most people expected, and this delivered an extra $3.2 million of income, along with tipping fees and some other town service revenues. From the state grant perspective, we came in about $400,000 above budget. We do not get a lot of state aid, and while it is very volatile on a percentage basis, it has a very small effect on our overall budget and your overall taxes. We've learned to live off of just Darien property taxes for the most part. And then lastly, the contribution from fund balance. Incorporating some capital projects that we moved sort of outside the normal budget process that included some security measures at the schools, the new buses that the Board of Ed spoke about and so forth. We ended up not using the $3.8 million that we had identified to use from fund balance. So that'll be recycled back in and be available to help support the budget this year. On the expenditure side, the town came in around $1.1 million under budget, primarily due to vacancies and so forth that existed throughout the different departments. The Board of Ed, after providing them a supplemental appropriation of $180,000, basically came in right on budget. So effectively, they were 180,000 above budget versus what you all approved last May. Debt service was spot on. And from the capital perspective, nothing really changed. We moved forward with all the capital that we had. When you look at overall expenditures, this is everything that we're spending. This is not net of revenues that we collect, whether they be state grants, whether they be town clerk revenues, investment income. This is everything that we spend. And you can see that this has continued to trend up and that the 1-year compounded annual growth rate is significantly greater than the 3-year and the 10-year. If you ask why are expenditures going up by 7%, but our taxes went up by materially less last year? Well, one, it was an expansion of the grant list due to some of the projects you heard Mr. Mulvaney talk about, and also in part because we added over $3 million from fund balance to help alleviate some of that increase. But that fund balance is a finite resource, and we can't continue to count on it. The schools occupy about 75% of our overall expenditures. When you look at enrollment, you can see back in 2014-15, enrollment peaked at just under 5,000 students. And while this graph isn't exactly to scale, it's meant to kind of show you the absolute amount of changes here. We've seen enrollment drop through 2021, tick back up a little bit, tick back down, and remain relatively steady over the last couple years. At the same time, if we look at the overall expenditures per student, as the enrollments come down by 3 or 4%, the expenditures per student have continued to rise. Over the last 5 years, 4.2% on average, while the student population has come down. Debt. We've had a lot of big capital projects. We just officially closed out the Oxford Elementary School, which is certainly one of the nicest elementary schools in the state. It came in under budget, and I think in everyone's view that was a great success. That project was close to $60 million. The acquisition of Great Island was $85 million, and we've bonded another $5 million approximately to deal with some of the expanded access and to pay for the consultants and so forth that we brought on board to help us with the vision of the island as well as the master plan. So our debt, you can see the debt that's outstanding has spiked from 84 million to 184 million. And we expect this spring we'll issue between 45 and 50 million more depending on the cadence of the HHR construction to fund the second phase of that project. So our debt is expected by the end of next year to be in the $225 to $235 million range. But the actual amount of debt outstanding is not necessarily our first focus. It's what the actual debt service is. Over the past 6 or 7 years, we've worked in connection with refinancing existing bonds and issuing new debt to level out our debt service, to change our debt structure from one which was a 20-year level principal payment to what is a 20-year, and in the case of Great Island, 30-year level debt service, much like your mortgages. And in some cases, we've deferred principal for a couple years in order to stack the new debt service on top of the old, much like the game of Tetris. And it's worked. It's allowed us to spend $103 million for HHR, close to $60 million for Oxford, $90+ million for Great Island and some of the build out, and not materially change debt service, either absolutely or as a percentage of our overall budget, which is what we keep an eye on. Interest rates. Interest rates, in terms of where we can borrow money, there's been a lot of volatility on the right third of that graph, but are basically back to where they were last year when we spoke. So in terms of long-term rates, 10, 20, and 30-year municipal bonds in the AAA category, which is what Darien is rated, our borrowing cost hasn't really changed over the last year. But what this graph does not talk about is short-term rates. And I mentioned our treasurer was very successful. We came in over $3 million above budget in our investment earnings. But interest rates are definitely coming down. There's an expectation that next month you'll see another cut, and then the Fed will pick up a policy of sort of every other meeting cutting. So we're not going to continue to be able to rely on those investment earnings off of our fund balance and of our bonded proceeds that we're using to build out HHR and some of the other projects. We're not going to be able to continue to rely on that. So as we begin to think about what taxes are going to look like in our model, if you listen to our meeting from a month ago, we've started to factor in cutting our investment earnings by 25% in an absolute dollar sense. So good news, borrowing rates are steady. Bad news, investment rates are coming down. This page, the Board of Finance at our last meeting discussed overall guidance. And we've changed the format by which we're communicating this guidance. Last year, in the last few years, and following in John's footsteps, we talked a lot about sort of core and growth. We've switched this to talk a little bit more about what are the core services that we need to offer, on the town side and the school side, and what are the priorities? What are the high priority services? What are the medium priority? And what are the lower priority services? So as the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Education move forward in developing their budgets, these are things that we'd like them to take into account. The Board of Finances, our responsibility is to determine the overall appropriations for both the schools and the town. Pull that together in a spreadsheet, our funds on hand, bonding, other types of things such as ground list growth, and put forward an overall package to be brought forward to the RTM for you all to consider and ultimately vote on. But it's very clear that the spending decision, the taxing decisions we make, and the appropriation decisions that we make, not only do they affect your taxes and what you pay every January 1 and July 1, but they affect the amount of money that's available to the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Ed to run their operations. So these are inevitably tied. Members of the Board of Finance need to consider the effects of our decisions on running the town services, and members of the Board of Ed and the Board of Selectmen need to think about the spending decisions and the prioritization that they make, decisions that they make, and how that ultimately affect the taxpayer. We're effectively one big team. So what we've asked other boards, as we've seen some of our core expenses, whether they be contractual pay increases for our staff partners, whether they be the cost of health care for our staff or other capital projects and so forth, we've asked them to look at and prioritize all the different things that they're delivering and make sure that the resources are focused on things that are core and things that are very high priority. On the third line here, in terms of efficiency and technology, and I think Jill mentioned a few that they discovered during their last budget season as it relates to staffing, as it relates to insourcing and outsourcing, the use of technology. All of our boards, including our department heads, need to be thinking about how they can do things, deliver the same services more efficiently or cheaper, or how they can, for the same amount of money, enhance the services that we're delivering, if that's what our residents want. And I think transparency and communication. I think, our board believes that as we're developing these budgets, we're trying to paint the financial picture for the town for the next 12 months. And so we would like all capital projects to be brought forward at the same time that the Board of Ed and Board of Selectmen, the Board of Finance, and ultimately you all are making the taxation decisions for town. We think the off-cycle appropriations, while there are many times when they're needed, when something breaks, during COVID we had to make special appropriations, the money is there to make those appropriations. But from an overall spending and planning perspective, we would like all those to come forward at the budget time so we can all make one large informed decision. I talked a little bit before about the circularity of budgeting, spending, appropriation, and taxing. the operating decisions, the services that the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Ed choose to deliver, whether it's buying an island, building new schools on the capital side, whether it's new programs, new staffing models, new languages, new maintenance delivery programs on the town side, or Parks and Rec initiatives and so forth. It all ultimately comes back and we need to pay for it, and it affects our taxation. And so those things need to all be considered when the boards are developing their budgets. And likewise, as I said, when the Board of Finance is considering the appropriations, we need to think about how and where is that going to affect the operations of the two individual boards. This is one way where we've asked the boards to think about their budgeting. On the left side, there's a graphic here. It's the same one you all may have seen at one of our meetings a few weeks ago. But when I think about our budgets, they have core aspects of the budget, things that are basic services, that are state or federally mandated. They deal with the safety and well-being of our residents and our staff. We need them to maintain our infrastructure and so forth. These are core services. Outside those core services are other services that are not core. Does not mean they're not important to the residents of this town or to the public and to our boards. But there's lower priority non-core services, and there's higher priority non-core services. Doesn't mean that any of those services are bad or not valued by our constituents, but we need to kind of think about how we're prioritizing these. Because as you see, if we move to the right-hand side of the page, when our core services, the cost of our core services expand, like we've seen over the past few years, and even the cost of our core or non-core but high priority services expand, that increases the size of that circle. And if we all here believe that the size of the overall circle, the overall budget is going to be limited, the increase each year, then we need to think about how we're going to spend those dollars inside core, high priority, and lower priority type items so that we can all deliver, back to what I said in the first page, the balance of great schools, great services, great facilities, and a fair and appropriate and competitive tax rate. This is analysis we put together where we looked at what we know today going into budget season. We made some assumptions around the ground list. We assume that the ground list expands by 1%. Again, that's kitchens, bathrooms, pools, new cars. We assume the collection rate stays the same at 99.5%. We assume debt service goes up by 18%. Now, there was a dip last year, so that's bringing that back up, and we're going to term out some of our bond anticipation notes. And we assume that the investment earnings are about $2.7 million, down about 25% from what we budgeted last year, which would be down almost 50% from what we actually realized this year. So what does that mean? Based on those assumptions, if you look at these two graphics across the top, we looked at what are the increases in operating expenses and capital expenses that we can bear. And on the column on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, is the amount of money we're able to use from our general fund. Last year we used just over $3 million. So if you look in the middle of these two graphics, the top one being the overall tax levy, the total of tax dollars that we levy from all the residents of Darien, a 3.5% operating budget increase and capital budget increase, paired with a $2 million contribution from fund balance, would generate a 4.9% increase in the overall tax levy. Now that's up a little bit from what we talked about 3 or 4 weeks ago as we further adjusted some of our assumptions around bonding, interest rates, and so forth. And if you move to the second table below that, the second table on the page, that basically shows what happens to the mill rate. And you'll see it's the same set of assumptions, 3.5% increase in operating expenses and 3.5% increase in capital expenses, paired with a $2 million contribution from fund balance. That would equate to a 3.8% mill rate increase. Now the reason we have a 4.9% tax levy increase, but only a 3.8% mill rate increase, it's because the grand list, we're assuming it's growing. Again, some of the smaller projects, plus some of the larger ones that you've talked about coming online. So as we've updated this just from a month ago, we're going to continue to track this. We're going to look at where our surpluses are coming in from last year. We're going to look at how the general fund is performing. We're going to look at the budgets that are put forward to us, both on the capital side and the operating side, and we'll continue to keep you all updated with this chart, and we'll work with our colleagues on the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Ed to help make sure in May or in April, when our board approves a budget to be brought in front of you all in May, it's something that's been well thought out. We've been very transparent about. You guys are very informed about, and you all can make an informed decision. I feel like, this is my 10th year on the Board of Finance, going on 18 years in terms of, serving on the finance role. And, a lot of times when the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Education do their job in terms of putting together a budget, and it comes to our board and we review it, adjust it, increase, decrease, shift it, encourage them to push stuff to another year, and ultimately sort of bring it to the RTM for approval. 99% of the time that you all approve that. And I appreciate that. And I know that you're not just approving it because you're just come in and show up every time to say yes. Hopefully it's because the two operating boards and the Board of Finance have put a lot of work and time into it. We try to take feedback from you all, certainly on the finance and budget side, from Jack and his team there, try to take input throughout the entire budget process so that when we bring it to you, you've been able to see what we've done, why we've gotten there, why we made some of the decisions that we've made, and ultimately when it comes in front of you, because you are ultimately the ultimate appropriating body of all dollars that we spend in this town, that it's in a package that you all will support. So I appreciate all the work that you guys have done in the past and will continue to do throughout this budget season. So with that, I'd like to wish everybody a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year and a safe holiday.